We'd like to sincerely thank our event sponsors. We have PAX, we have Rack Center and Links that have helpfully sponsored this session. And we also have the series sponsors, which are Facebook and NAP Africa. And we're eternally grateful to these organizations because we wouldn't be here without them. And they've supported us throughout our organization's lifetime, not only with AFPIC, but through the changing circumstances of COVID and everything else. So we're very grateful to all of them, and we can't thank them enough. And in addition to that, we've got Flex Optics as an additional sponsor today with the translation, which is extremely helpful. You know, these things tend to be in English, but we're very aware that there's a lot of other languages out there, and you know, we accommodate what we can. And today that's French, but that again wouldn't be possible without Flex Optics. So thank you guys. Now, before we go any further, sort of an important announcement, I'd say a big announcement. Last year, due to COVID, we had to postpone our regular AFPIF, the Peering and Interconnection event that we host every August physically. And unfortunately, we're going to do the same thing this year. We're going to postpone AFPIF to 2022. We're all very disappointed about that, but we don't think the world is going to be ready for an in-person event of the sort of magnitude of what we like to do at AFPIF by August or within this year. But we are optimistic that we'll be able to host again in 2022, and our intention is to carry on with Rwanda as the host country. So we look forward to that. Next slide. So in place of the physical event, we're going to continue with the virtual peering series format, but with a slightly adjusted schedule. So aside from this event, following this event, we'll be hosting another event in May. We're going to revisit the franchise versus homegrown IXP topic that was very popular, and we felt like there was a lot more that could be discussed around that. So that's the next event coming up. And then we have events each quarter following that and into February 2022. And those will be announced in the near future, likely at the May event about franchise and homegrown IXPs part 2. Next slide. So on with the panel. Just to talk briefly about the topic, we're here to talk about the evolving internet industry. The global internet industry is consolidating. So more and more traffic is emanating from fewer autonomous systems every day, primarily due to the growth of global cloud and content delivery services. And as more content and services migrate to these platforms, we're seeing them work to expand their private global network out to the internet's edge via submarine cables, which they build or rent, and even terrestrial networks, where they then deploy POPs and inland data centers, for example, in our region in Africa and elsewhere, where they interconnect directly with eyeball networks. And so this is changing the landscape. And so we're going to explore what this phenomenon means with a focus on internet exchange points and how it's going to affect the downstream ecosystems. This topic was originally inspired by Geoff Huston, who is with us today as one of our panelists. He's been talking about the death of transit and this concept for quite a while. And I remember seeing the speech he gave at RIPE in Dubai and thinking to myself that it would be interesting to explore what this means further downstream, like with internet exchanges. And so I'd like to thank Geoff for really pushing this issue and trying to bring it to the forefront so that we can all try to stay ahead of the curve. Alongside Geoff, we have Christian Kaufmann, who's the Vice President of Technology at Akamai. We have Mark Tinka, who's the Head of Engineering at SEACOM. We have Patrick Christian, who's the Principal Analyst at TeleGeography, and Edrich Lange, who's the Chair at the INX-ZA, which is the Internet Service Provider Association of South Africa, who also hosts the INX exchange points down there. Next slide. If there is no next slide, then I think this is the right time for me to hand over to Caglar, who's going to lead us through the first section of the discussion. So Caglar, if you're there, please take it away.
I am here. Thank you very much, everyone. It will be a repetition, but I cannot thank enough to everyone that has made this session possible. First of all, the sponsors and our panelists, obviously. Some of them are joining in the middle of the night. Some of them are joining in the very early morning. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to our audience as well. So in the first section of this session, we will try to find an answer to what is happening with the industry. How is the industry evolving? So what is happening and why? And what is the motivation of this consolidation in the internet traffic? And where will we go next, and what will be the limit of this expansion? So to kick off, we will have Patrick Christian of TeleGeography, who will give us a presentation about the current state of cloud and the content delivery networks. So Patrick, you're up.
All right. Hello, everyone. Let's see, can we start with the first slide? I'm going to start with some slides as I've been known to do at AFPIFs. So next slide. Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so let's start with a few slides that may help illustrate the growth of cloud and content providers, especially compared to internet backbone providers, the major transit providers, to give some background for this discussion. So tracking the growth of content provider private networks versus the internet. Let's begin by looking at the growth of cloud provider data centers. Of course, this is just a subset of content provider services, but it's one that's the fastest growing segment, one of the fastest growing segments, and kind of illustrates what's happening in terms of infrastructure build out. So let's go back a little. Let's start in 2006. And this slide shows 2006, 2015. 2006 is when AWS launched its first cloud region. It was followed very closely with Azure and Alibaba in 2008 and 2011. Of course, this slide, of course, only shows the big three. It doesn't include providers like Facebook, but this kind of shows Facebook is growing in a similar fashion, where they're putting in data centers, et cetera, and the rate of growth and the geography of the growth is similar to the major CSPs for other large content providers. Around 2010, just to give you some context on used bandwidth at the time, around 2010, content provider private networks accounted for less than 10% of total global used bandwidth, while international internet backbone was almost 80%. Next slide. Okay, and this, we see the change. In the previous slide, we saw where the data centers were located. It's mostly the more developed, mature markets in US, Western Europe, and parts of East Asia. And now we've seen the data centers as they're pushing data closer to end user, and as the traffic and demand arrives in different locations, we're seeing data centers, expanding out of the mature markets. And of course, what precedes this are the caches and the POPs, but then you see the data centers arrive. And this kind of gives you a good indication of the growth. So in 2015 is when Google started building their cloud data centers, and then Oracle began in 2019. From 2006 to 2015, they were averaging 2 new data centers, cloud data centers a year. But by 2015 to 2019, averaging 15 new cloud regions or data centers per year. And then in 2020, we saw 28 go live. And then, I'm sorry, in 2019. And then in 2020, with COVID, slowed down a little bit, only 21. But there's already 43 planned for the next year or two. So in very, very strong growth we're seeing. And this is kind of illustrates the demand that's growing for content providers. So where do we see the largest demand for international capacity is between the data centers. What connects the DCs? subcables. Let's go to the next slide. In the early days, content providers mostly bought capacity, but starting with Google, Google started to invest, was the first to invest in its own subcables in about 2010, Unity. But it wasn't until 2015, 2016 that we saw more content players get into the subcable game. And why did they start building their own cables versus buying from carriers? It's more cost efficient given the amount of capacity that they were buying. Plus they have more control over landings and management of cable and where they're going. Now, it's interesting to keep in mind that of the 40 content provider cables that are coming out, I'm sorry, actually getting ahead of myself, only 6 are actually sole proprietary cables. They're usually in consortiums, but we'll talk about this a little bit more, but content providers, we had this idea that now content providers are on every cable, but in reality, it's about a quarter of the cables, a little bit more through 2022. But of course, it's focused in certain markets like transatlantic, which 80% of investment for subcables is content provider. Whereas if you go to other markets further away, like South America, Africa, it drops to a much lower level. And this is, once again, because connecting data centers, more than connecting data centers to end users. Okay, next slide, please. This is just an illustration of how much capacity is actually between each region. Globally, content provider networks account for over 60% of international use bandwidth, which is, up a lot more than 10% in 2010. But this, of course, isn't spread evenly like we were showing before. This illustrates the transatlantic and trans-Pacific and intra-Asian routes have a very high share of content provider use bandwidth. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so our content networks moving closer to end users and localization of content affecting international internet and carriers. The short answer is yes, but how much? Internet backbone provider capacity is still growing at a healthy rate. If we look, oh, I'm sorry, actually, one more slide, please. This still shows the routes. There we go. Okay. As we see in this slide, the others, that's internet backbone capacity. And then in the dark blue are the content providers. Okay, we see that internet backbone providers, the growth is still healthy. It's up in the 20s, the upper 20%, but it's dwarfed by content provider growth, which is, averages around 75%, 80%. Okay, and we would expect as content providers are growing that maybe talking about the death of transit, that we'd see lowering of international capacity growth. But for the moment, in the last like 4 years, 5 years, we're still seeing steady growth. It's not growth like back in 2010, which was 40 to 50% growth, but we're still seeing about 30% growth. So that's a little bit surprising, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And I'll leave it at that, and let's talk a little bit more in detail about what else is going on in the market with the others.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was great information. Actually, we have been seeing this for a number of years, and content providers and the cloud providers are bringing the content to the end users and not the other way around. And I would like to kick off the panel actually with our first question. Geoff, you will be first up. So why is this happening? So why is the internet traffic being privatized in the content provider and cloud provider networks? And what is the motivation of these huge companies?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and hello all. To answer that, you've actually got to go back almost 20 years and actually understand, and it does seem a long time ago, but understand at the time, that the content folk were having a really hard time because no one liked a paywall. No one liked the idea of actually trying to make pay-per-view content. And the content industry was looking at the internet going, but where's the money? And so they went to the carriers, the ISPs, and said, the only reason why you've got customers is us. They're the only reason why they're paying you money. So look, here's the deal. You, carriage access providers and carriage folk, pay us money, some of the money you're getting from those users, and we'll all be happy. Share the income and we're cool. Now, the carriage providers might not have been telcos, but they sure as hell had telco mentality. These guys were bellheads through and through. So what they said was, I'm sorry, everyone's a customer. We actually don't care if you're a content provider or an end user or anyone else. Everybody's a customer. So tell you what, here's the deal, you pay. And the content folk are kind of going, this is really hard. You're saying we have to go and make relationships with end users. And the carriage folk, knowing full well that this was really hard, but yeah, absolutely. The content folk didn't stop there though. They looked at the newspaper industry, the advertising industry, the radio industry, and said, look, tell you what, we can sell advertising inside content. Let's go to advertisers and offer them better advertisements. And you saw this first with DoubleClick, but all of a sudden, what you found was content had tapped into a richer market than the carriage folk ever dreamt of. So instead of this large carriage industry and this tiny content industry, content ballooned. So now the largest companies in the world today are content companies because basically they tapped into this enormous market worth literally trillions of dollars. So what happened then was they look at the carriage industry going, why should you be between us and our customers? Why should you try and broker users to us? Get out of the way. Now, if you've got no money, you've got no choices. If you've got all the money in the world, you can do anything you want. And what we've actually seen over the last 10 years is the enormous amounts of capital that are buried inside content because of the advertising market largely, now driving the entire industry. If you look at our own conversations now, go back 10 years, who was tier one? Who is peering? How do we work out this ecosystem of exchanging traffic? If you look at it today, can you please build a data center inside my city? Please, please. And that's the entire conversation today. There is no more your content behind your sort of ISP needs to be accessed by my customers. That doesn't happen. Users don't talk to users. Services aren't buried inside ISPs anymore. It's all externalized. And the market is, if you will, so vibrant that the options are, I can pay folk like Amazon or Akamai money, or if I don't feel like paying money, I can go to Cloudflare and go, it's free. So every single option of clouding your content is available at every single price point, including none. And you sit there and wonder, who's got carriage? Well, it certainly isn't the old carriage industry. The other part of this is that as soon as a customer becomes bigger than the provider, you're no longer the provider, you're the customer too. And because all of this growth, as you see with Patrick's slides, all of this growth has actually been in content, the customer has become bigger than the provider. The customer's now saying, I'm sorry, we're the only reason why you exist. Tell you what, unless you shave your margins, in fact, no, don't worry about it. We'll just do it ourselves anyway. More control, more reliability, better service. So all of a sudden, the ISPs and the carriage providers as carriage providers to everyone, the old telco regime, gone. Transit's dead. You know, the residual bits of traffic are actually just artifacts that are dying. You know, people still ride horses, probably for entertainment. There is still some degree of carriage between service providers, but I tell you what, it's largely historic and almost nostalgic. It has no role in the future internet. It's just totally driven by content. So that's how it got there. And if you will, the situation today is we're ruled by a remarkably small number of content platforms that literally have sucked almost all the money out of this industry and are dictating terms. So, you know, CK, let's hear it from the content side. You know, how do you feel about all this?
I was going to ask CK, actually, that would be my second question. So what is the motivation of Akamai from a content provider point of view to privatize the traffic that otherwise would be on the IP transit and building Akamai's own network, right? And how do you see also the limits of the expansion? Will Akamai be in every access network present and will be transit free at some point?
Thanks, Chala. First of all, a comment to Geoff. I think I will use your analogy next time I have a conversation with the tier one and say, oh, we just keep you for entertainment's sake. You're just like little horses or so. See if that goes well.
Exactly. See how they like it.
But coming back to Chala's question, they're kind of twofold, right? There's one question, how we as an content company react to it. And then there is the growth potential. Probably actually one statement up front, because so far we have used content and cloud very interchangeable in this context. And on some level they are, on some not at all. So from a business perspective, I think it is certainly true that this is where the content is, the money goes, the attention in the ecosystem. And so from that point of view, it's a fair analogy. But if you actually look at the business models, not every content has a cloud, not every cloud has a proper content or CDN. So I think the cloud providers, I see them, are more like the Google, Microsoft, Azure, where they have a computing engine, big data centers, which you cannot easily put to the edge. And that is one of the big differences. And if you want to connect them, this is where you need either big data centers and also a big backbone in between. And then you have the CDN part where you have then websites, content, videos, games to download, streaming, and these are the service you want to have as close as possible to the end user, because that's where the latency game really makes a difference. And they both work together, and some of the cloud have content and some of the content have a certain amount of cloud, but there are two things where, at least from a technical point and what you look at in the ecosystem, internet exchanges and so on, you actually have very different behaviors. So I will try to point that a little bit out as I talk. But back to the question finally. Why is Akamai doing that? So we talked about it in the past a little bit. We now started to build an own backbone as well, like actually 4 years ago. And one of the reasons for that was that when we actually peer with networks or when we transport the traffic, that we have it under own control. In the past, I think there were 2 or 3 things which we didn't really like in ISPs and internet service provider. One is the cost. Of course, that's always not particularly appreciated. But the other part was, you know, you were at their mercy, and they played their own games, right? They had their own business interests, and they used it to a certain degree as a weapon or as a leverage. So where they actually peer, where they hand over the traffic, if they are tromboning between continents and all of that, you were a little bit at their mercy. So even if we transported traffic from our own clusters, sometimes in the same city, the traffic probably didn't even stay in the same city, right? It might have tromboned even out of the country, even if we were like having clusters in 2 different data centers. So at a certain point, performance, reliability, and cost were actually the driver, where we said it's now cheaper and easier to build connectivity ourselves between it, transport it ourselves, instead of relying on a third party for that. The other part of your question was, what are the limits of expansion? And this, I think, goes more in the direction of caches. I think we are probably the network which has the biggest footprint, or one of the biggest, when it comes to caches, because we put them all over the world. And these are basically CDN caches, right? They're not a computational engine. They are to deliver traffic, downloads, websites, whatever our customers have. And we put them in 135 countries in the world. Like in Africa, we are pretty much in half of the countries, every second one or so. We have a presence. And when we look at what our limits of expansions are, then I think there are two coming to mind. One is a technical one. How can you actually handle these amount of servers? How can you distribute traffic between them and ensure that you have a good performance? And I think, to be honest, that is like the easier one, because if you do that for a while and you have whatever we call it, the mapping system, whatever technology you use to distribute the traffic between the clusters, you get that under control after a while. So, but that's a certain function, right? Because now we talk about thousands of clusters all over the world, or not a dozen or so. So how you steer traffic is certainly one aspect which limits your expansion. The other one is actually the business case. Netflix has a very different one than us. Their boxes are even bigger, right? And they have video, so they have even more hard disks. We have a mix of traffic, but all of this hardware costs money. So at least my estimation is, right, even the smallest cluster with the workload, the shipping, the installation, and all the maintenance and stuff you need, is like probably, to build it between $5,000 and $10,000, depending on where you go in the world and how big you build it. And if the transit savings or the internet exchange savings you are getting, plus whatever value you put on the performance of having it in that network, if that is not up to the amount of money you actually spend on CapEx and OpEx for the servers and the infrastructure, then it is probably a bad deal, because then you have the platform, but you pay on top of it. So you got to find a balance, what your customer want, what they pay you for it, and what the infrastructure costs you. And I think this is the biggest limitation of going into a country or into a network.
Cool, thank you, CK. I would like to ask, actually, going back to Patrick's presentation, I didn't expect that IP transit is growing 20% year over year. And my next question would be to you, or to answer. So how do you see the future of IP transit? Is it already dead? Will it stagnate at some point? Will we just bury IP transit at some point? And then I will go back to Mark to answer the very same question, and from his point of view as a carrier and access service provider, how will this impact the other carrier services?
And that was to me, not Christian, right? Patrick, Christian, not Christian.
Coffee. Did I say Christian?
No, I'm just joking. I'm just joking.
It would be to you, yeah.
Well, over the past years, I mean, coming to AFPIF, when we're hearing a lot about localization of content and caches, and moving, all the caches going in all over Africa, et cetera, and moving that there's less need for the international transit. So what we expected is, with all the localization, et cetera, that we'd start to see the amount of traffic, or the amount of used bandwidth dedicated to internet backbone providers would be dropping. And it has a little bit, like I said, from 40 or 50% early 2010s up to 2015, but not as fast as we thought. And in certain markets, like Latin America and Africa, we saw an uptick, actually, of growth. But I think in these markets, what's happening is, once you started to get caches in and pops, et cetera, and content more localized, there was a bump of growth kind of for everybody, okay? So you could really see, the international part growing, but also localization growing like crazy. And I think this kind of goes back to, I think Christian said this, one of the old AFPIFs like 5 years ago, once you put a cache in and the internet works and people can watch videos, everybody starts using it and demand goes up. And I remember the case study in Rwanda, I believe, where once they put in a cache, traffic grew, I don't know how much, 400%, and I don't know how long, a very short amount of time. So there we're getting the effect of just internet working better. So you have localization and you'll have international. Will we see this start to decrease over time? Possibly, but but I have to admit, I was a little bit surprised to see that it hasn't dropped as much as we see this localization.
But Patrick, I think that's
Yeah.
actually just a failure of putting data centers everywhere, and it's just an eventual process. No traffic is end-to-end anymore. We made sure of that when we deployed NATs. I just can't see you. I can't send you packets, and try as you might, you can't get packets to me. Every last byte out there on the network is mediated. It goes through something in the middle, because that's the only protocol model that we have. And oddly enough, IPv6, meant to fix all that, doesn't do a thing. IPv6 doesn't work end-to-end either, oddly enough. Privacy addresses, etc. No one's put services out at the edge. So all you're seeing with this ISP transit is they haven't yet clouded their service. It's not that they won't in the future, it's just they haven't yet. But don't forget, there is no end-to-end traffic anymore. And this whole end-to-end is largely a mythology these days. It just doesn't exist. And so the residuals are just folk who haven't got it yet. There are still enterprise networks out there in somebody's basement. God knows why. It is just an anachronism. Sooner or later, they'll ditch all that hardware and do what the rest of us have done, fire their IT department and just go cloud, because, that's today's fashion. And, this industry is not immune to that kind of trend. So, yeah, it's going there. It's just wait for a month or two and it'll move.
Probably a little bit more than a month, but yeah, we're seeing that. We were enterprises. It's you guys are light years ahead of where enterprises are in moving, their enterprise or their WANs to the cloud. But yeah, exactly. Point taken.
Mark, what do you think?
Mark's turn. Yeah.
Yeah. So hi guys. So when I lived in KL in Kuala Lumpur back in somewhere between 2007 and 2012. Around 2010, we started getting to a plateau of selling IP transit as a local carrier in Malaysia. And that was because in addition to being there, we also had NTT, we had PCCW, the usual suspects, and they're selling at a much higher price. And I think it stagnated because the only place to get content from at the time was from, West Coast US. So when cable started going in, specifically when the content folk began building cables, so Google got into Unity, they got into SJC and so on and so forth, essentially connecting Southeast Asia to Los Angeles, is when we began to see more content now coming down specifically into Singapore, into Malaysia, into Thailand, into the Philippines and whatnot. And then we began to see, as Patrick was saying, an uptick in IP transit, not necessarily from the NTTs and the PCCWs, but from the small moms and pops that were coming up in the region to serve the new breed of FTTH providers that were coming up. And in those days, we sort of began to say, well, content is not king, connectivity is king. Because before the iPhone and all of that, SMS was the big moneymaker. I mean, SMS was making a lot more money than Hollywood those days, right? And we realized that was the connectivity aspect of it, Facebook, YouTube, people actually sharing. And that's where the content folk have figured it out, that it's not about me being out there as a big brand. It's about me creating a platform where people can connect with one another and share common or uncommon ideas, right? So they take themselves out of the equation and just allow people to come together. So that connectivity aspect is what has allowed them to prosper. And that's where I think the traditional telco has sort of failed to adapt. And that's why, as much as we are still relevant in our own way, telcos are sort of dying in that respect. So I mean, fast forward to Africa 2021, it's the same story, right? You have Equiano being built by Google, you've got To Africa being built by Facebook and everything else in between that should be launched between 22, 23, 24, this decade. And what that essentially means is that the demand for IP transit, in the sense that we call it from continent to continent, is not going to go away, but it's going to drastically reduce, because then you're going to have most of the content either from the guys that own the cable or the rest of the content players that they will facilitate to come into Africa, bring in local presence, data centers, caches, whatever. So the IP transit is still likely to remain, but not at that intercontinental level. It's going to remain more at a regional a national level. A smaller ISP is going to provide connectivity from, you know, somebody's home to the local exchange point type thing. And that's where you're going to see a lot more growth. But at the same time, you're going to see a lot more devaluation in margin, which also is going to mean maybe a huge potential for consolidation, which also has the potential for going back into one or two monopolies that, you know, then the whole process starts again. So that's where I sort of see IP transit going. And it's going to be a case of which IP transit network is actually small enough, not big enough, but small enough to survive. Because the behemoths that used to be the IP transit or the telco game probably have enough cash to see them going, but not enough culture to see them adapting. So they might fizzle out. If you're small enough and you have a small, nimble team that can actually make it work in this tighter margin where the majority of the traffic is being controlled by a few folk, then there's a good chance you will survive.
Thank you, Mark. It is really valuable opinions, and it is also a good relation to the next section of the panel, where we will discuss the implications of this phenomenon to the IXPs over time. Before handing over to Kyle, we have two poll questions, the results of which we will be telling at the end of the panel. So first of all, we're asking the audience how you heard about this event. Is it social media, mailing list, colleague or friend, AFIF website, or other? And the second poll question, if we can bring it up.
Yeah, give me a second because people are currently actively voting for this one. So
okay, let's wait
10 seconds.
Okay, let's wait for a few seconds. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, let me close this one. We're like almost at 75% of the attendees that voted. So I'll close this one and I'll share the results right away.
We can share the results also after the Q&A if you want.
I can do that as well. No problem.
Let's do that.
I'll keep the results for myself for this moment then.
Okay.
And I'll continue with the second poll question.
Thank you. So the second question, do you think the internet industry's evolution will have a positive impact on society? Yes, no, and maybe. Cool. I think we can continue while people are voting. Before I hand over to Kyle, I would like to ask him if he's seeing the impact of this evolution on his IX as an IXP operator, and also being in this industry for a number of years in East Africa. And yeah, Kyle, it's yours.
Thanks, Caglar. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an interesting one, right? So we just talked a lot about how interregional cables and carriers are being affected by the growth of these content networks, but in my view, it's not just limited to that, right? These new cables, for example, coming down the coast of East Africa. One of the content companies, for example, is building down the coast, and they're going to trade access to their subcable for terrestrial routes inland to the content companies, right? So you've got a terrestrial network operator that's trading access to their fiber network for access to a sea cable built by a content company, which means that those content companies are actually building out inland as well. And they're coming into our region and deploying POPs with infrastructure that in some cases is more significant than just edge caches, right? So this is coming downstream, and we're sort of at the, we're kind of at the tail end of the food chain in Uganda from an internet infrastructure point of view. And so we wonder about this, and we wonder how it's going to affect our internet exchange and the ecosystem around us, not just in Uganda, but in East Africa, because we're sort of all in it together. And that leads us into the next section, which is really about how this is going to affect downstream internet ecosystems with a focus on the internet exchange point of view. But also, eventually, we're going to talk about from a regulatory point of view as well, and what regulators might be able to do to successfully navigate this evolving situation. But to start with, I'm curious to know when these content companies come down and, for example, in Uganda, start deploying more significant infrastructure, are they going to prefer to interconnect with local access networks and other networks via IXPs, or are they going to push for PNIs? And will their preferences vary by market? And if so, why? And in my mind, I imagine two different scenarios. One, you might have a market like Uganda, which has a large number of small access networks, where the content companies may not be able to justify on net caches or whatever. And then you might have another market like Rwanda or others that have a smaller number of larger, mobile network operators that comprise their market. So I'm wondering if things will play out differently in those markets, or if there's other scenarios that might have an impact on the outcome of how this plays out. And so I guess I'll throw that question to CK as a content network. What are your thoughts on how content networks will engage in these markets when they come downstream into places like Uganda?
I would like to answer a little bit more generic, if okay, but I give you the various flavors of it. So let's not get nailed down on the Uganda itself. I think it very much depends on the country, to be honest, but let me give you a couple of scenarios. So one part is it very much depends on how much traffic the country has, or the region, for argument's sake, and how good deregulation was, how many market participants you have. If you have one market participant, 80% or whatever, and then just one or two small ones, then you do a PNI, or, in the case of eyeball networks, which can actually, content networks which have on-net clusters, like half of them or 2/3 of them have by now, you actually go into the network itself, right? And then you have that one pretty much covered. Then you don't even need a classical PNI, because then you sit in their network. If the country is very deregulated and you have, 10 market participants, then there is a bigger chance that you're also do peering out of a data center, not just on net or a mix of it. Usually it's a mix and a hybrid model. But then you probably do the majority of PNIs. PNIs is always a question, pretty much the same as when you go to an internet exchange, in Europe or so. When do you do actually PNIs, and when do you stay at the IX? And it's a question, right, of usually a money question, to be honest, a business model. What does it cost me to transport it over the IX? And usually, I guess these days we address more long tail, because you get then 100 provider, 200, with a 10 gig or 100 gig, whatever your volume level is. But if you just have 10 people on it anyway, and 2 or 3 big ones, then you probably don't join IX for 5 small ones, right? Where you barely fill a 1 gig or a 10 gig, then that's probably not a good equation. So it depends on the deregulation of the market and the traffic volumes. And less deregulation, less traffic volumes, more on-net and PNI. And in the other dimension, if you have a lot of participants and then big IX, interregional or international, like South Africa has some, right? Terraco also. Then you also have a much bigger chance that you actually participate at the IX.
Cool, thanks. And I also wanted to throw this question to Ed. Sorry, Geoff, you were going to jump in?
Yeah, I think you should actually look at it from the other perspective. If IXPs aren't joining content and service to customers in access networks. Is there any other role for an IXP today? You know, that's the only arrow you've got to shoot. There's no other business model for an IXP anymore. We went and killed edge to edge years ago. And so asking, you know, what's your business model? Well, it's connecting content and service to users. That's the only thing left. You know, backs against the wall time, folks. That's it. And PNIs, unless you can host the two edges in your IXP facilities, PNIs are your enemy, not your friend. You know, this is all you've got to sell anymore. Part of the problem we have in this industry is it changes so quickly. Management and money lags reality. And I would desperately say to you, get real, get with today, and understand what you're in. You're the interface between Google and everyone else. You know, enjoy it and all that, but that's all you've got. So, you know, it's a tough world out there.
Right.
And I think just to add on to what Geoff is saying, I mean, you know, I've been saying at least for many years to come, that infrastructure is really no longer a play, right? And, you know, you look at the big mobile operators right now that, you know, are raking hundreds of millions of dollars every month. They're probably raking billions of dollars every month when they're doing SMS, right? And they're probably raking millions of dollars, tens of millions, you know, 10 years ago before data became a thing, because the cost of data is doing that, but the revenue from data is doing that. And ultimately, infrastructure in and of itself, traditionally as we've known it, is no longer a play. It's not long-term anymore. And that's where, you know, traditional infrastructure players, you know, ISPs, telcos, mobile operators, whatever, have struggled to shift their culture away from actually working in a way that they produce value for the end user or for the customers that they serve. And I think that's really what Geoff is trying to say, and what I totally subscribe to, is that infrastructure in and of itself, be it exchange points, be it telco, be it last mile, be it whatever, is not a play anymore. And either you are the behemoth in that market and there's no other choice until something else happens, or it's highly competitive and all of you are going to find a way to die slowly type thing.
Let me add something before it gets overly dystopian negative and the IXs start to commit suicide. There is a role, right? And the same is actually, I think, true for transit. The majority of the traffic, cloud content, moves off and does their own thing. Fair enough. That might be whatever, 80% or so. But you still want to send an email to someone randomly in Brazil, if you know, or, you know, do something where you need full the DFZ and full connectivity. And so transit will be there for that part. It will, I don't think it will die, but, you know, in comparison to the big cake, it will be, of course, a much smaller slice. And I think the same is true for IXs if they're big enough, right? If I connect and I get 100 to 300 peers, even if I move the top 10 off, I still want to have connectivity to the small one because it's easier with one port. So the argumentation which we had for IXs is true as well, but more like on a long tail base. And then I think these ones will actually survive and have a
right. And I also think, in my view, as an internet exchange point operator, that internet exchanges can serve the same purpose they did when they were used to route around incumbents that were routing all the traffic between networks and markets before the exchange popped up. Right now, that still might be a small slice of the pie in the content world because they emanate most of the traffic. But in my view, they might provide some kind of counter pressure against market inefficiencies if the content guys become too aggregated and start abusing their power. But again, it'll be limited in scope. I think the golden era may be in decline. But I wanted to get Ed's perspective on this because Ed set up an internet exchange in Durban, I think, on the basis of getting the internet service provider community together in order to sort of aggregate demand for the content networks. Ed, are you there? And do you have some insight to share with us on that?
I think he's kind of muted.
Yeah, we'll give him a second. Maybe he's there. He is. I think he's unmuted now. Ed, are you with us? Okay. Well, in that case, I'll move on to a sort of a follow-up question, which is about leverage, right? So if IXPs become demand aggregators for these content networks, at least in their primary role, then what kind of leverage our internet exchange is going to have over the content companies. And I mean that to lead to a question that's essentially, will we be able to get the content networks to pay for peering? And in what cases? Will that vary by market? And so what does that look like? And I can let me throw that to Geoff, and then we'll bring Ed in again.
Oh, you love living in the past, don't you, Kyle? I'm like, this was the play that Comcast tried against Netflix. And quite frankly, it was a rubbish play then, and it's a rubbish play now. I'm like, there are so many ways to get to the user. And quite frankly, content withholding is actually the worst possible threat. Google tried this against the Australian government, and despite all the consequent press, we caved. Content was actually too valuable. You can't, that's not the bargaining point, quite frankly. You're there merely as the intermediary between users and what they want to do. And that's the only reason why you get money. As soon as you try and play that into leverage against content, bad play. There's just nothing left for you. You will get steamrolled out of the place.
So
the whole issue
Then just to jump in as a follow-up question, then how does an IXP sustain itself? Does it push its fees exclusively to the access networks that are reaching out for the content?
Quite frankly, the only thing is you're playing the margins on a whole host of PNIs from content, which costs, versus your ability to aggregate that and actually offer a bulk service between content and users. You're the broker. You're just the intermediary. And the value, as Mark puts out, is actually the value of infrastructure. And that's a slim margin to live on. Quite frankly, this is the life you live. It would be so good if you could gold plate the taps in your bathrooms. It would be so good if you could mint money in the days of IXs of old. It's over. It's just a different world now. And, you've got to come to terms with that. There's no point trying to reinvent stuff we've done before and it failed.
Yeah, I think just to add on that, I think we're not saying that, ISPs and IXPs are going to literally die physically. What we're saying is there will be a play for infrastructure, but you have to accept the fact that you'll have to massively downsize. Where you had 2,000 staff, now you probably just need 20. Where you had 100,000 staff, you probably need 500. You know what I mean? You have to massively downsize and accept that those are the small margins you're willing to, and those margins will be there, I want to say forever, but they'll be there a long time, and that's your area. But the good old days of printing money like you used to in the days of SMS, those are gone. So the play is there. You just have to accept that you're going to have to scale down. So if you look at some models of some IXPs that have decided not to build metro, some IXPs that have decided not to build international, some IXPs that have decided not to build interconnect the data centers. Those are the kinds of plays we are talking about. You have to scale down, and then there's a chance that you might survive.
Right. And I want to bring CK and Ed into this, actually, because I remember, CK, we were talking about scenarios where Akamai can justify paying for peering at internet exchanges. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I was about to raise the hand. I would differentiate the wording a little bit, paying for peering, because that's not a very nice wording. Paying for the access port or, the peering port at the switch at the IX, sure. So there is a little bit I don't even know, I guess, statement or perception that content do not want to pay at all for infrastructure or the connection at an internet exchange. And I would differentiate that a little bit. Sure, like every commercial capitalistic company, you want to get it as cheap as possible and kind of for free, fair enough. But I think this is actually not what's, at least how Akamai plays it here. When we have a conversation about an internet exchange, what we do is the network architecture team, we actually look into it, how do we reach these networks already? What does it cost to go to these IX? How many prefixes do I get? How many traffic can I offset? What does the cluster cost me? And if I figure out that my infrastructure cost is actually higher than my savings, and I probably don't have any particular business reason to go to that IX, then my usual answer would be, no, it doesn't make any sense to me to come in. This is not very different than a business model of an ISP, right? If it doesn't make sense for the ISP to peer there for whatever reason he has, then he isn't coming either. So what we did in the past was we were then asked, it would be good, and Rwanda is probably a similar case, right? It would be really good if you come to the region and it would help the local people. And then we said, okay, we tried to make it work on our side. But this is basically the cost which we bear, and this is why it's not profitable. So if we can find agreements on various parts, and that can be, from hosting to the IX port to whatever, then the equation shifts, and then, I can actually join, because suddenly I'm not paying on top of to be at this IX. And if then the economics change, because you now have actually more traffic on it, because the traffic jumped 400%, or because either 4G, 5G, or whatever access technology you have in the particular country generates so much traffic, and the infrastructure cost comes down, then we usually start paying as well. That's at least from our point, right? We are not interested to extort a market and get everything for free. The question is, when does a business make sense? And instead of not coming to the market, we basically come, but with certain conditions. And at the moment where price point wise it makes sense, we are actually happy to support infrastructure. We rely on it as well, right? We cannot go everywhere in the world, get everything for free, and then everyone else goes bankrupt, out of business, and we have no transport mechanism. That's not the play here.
Great. And I've got a message from Ed. He's back online now with his headset. So I wanted to jump back to him and ask him about his experience in Durban.
Can you hear me now?
Ed, there you go. Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Ah, wonderful. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. My headset failed a bit. So in Durban, we're a bit of a weird setup in South Africa, and I think that might be a setup that mimics what many smaller African countries have. Is we're sort of the smaller cousin of the three big metropoles in South Africa, and there's been internet exchanges in Durban for a long time, but they were running slowly, and they didn't really get great levels of traffic in comparison to Johannesburg, where everyone seemed to want to connect to, or to Cape Town. And we tried to petition some content to actually come to Durban. We spoke to many people, and it was sort of just like, yeah, well, the 8 milliseconds to Johannesburg is just too close to actually want to put hardware down there. And so we first thought, okay, this is before I actually joined the IX, but we first thought, okay, we'll go to the IX and try and see if we can't host the stuff directly on the IX's network. But after discussing with many of our local players, having the IX get involved with hosting content providers directly is perhaps not the best idea always, as it would perhaps it'll be a conflict of interest with some of our peers. So what we rather then did is, under the local network operators group, we opted to approach these content providers and fund its cash flow via the various providers themselves. The IX obviously gave us a free port because it is beneficial there, but it is still completely separate from the IX. And that's how we got a reasonable chunk of content to Durban, where it went from doing, I think, sub 500 megs, and now we're doing sort of like, depending on peak, but sometimes more than 20 gigs out of just local content. And obviously more peers have come on board, so it's kind of been a snowball effect for the IX to grow as well. But the idea is that this would not be a long-term thing, because you don't want the local operators funding big corporates who have their own their own big budgets. So the idea is that this would have a short-term lifespan, but still just help the operators in the meantime and build the market case for the content providers in the long time. At least we hope that's going to be the goal, because we see other operators see the benefit of the IX and come and join separately. And there's been many other international peers who have joined the Durban market and the Durban exchanges.
Right. Thanks for that. So it sounds to me like one of the themes that I'm hearing through this conversation is that the long tail of networks is important to cater to, right? You need to bring it back to the Uganda example. We have a large number of access networks, and that's been a benefit to us, because then we can aggregate that demand at the internet exchange. And it sounds like that's community cooperation is very important, right? If you have a number of internet service providers in your market, it sounds like it's desirable to get together and agree that you're going to try to address the situation through a collective action through an internet exchange, for example. That's kind of what I'm hearing. I'm interested to hear if other people agree or disagree on the panel.
Well, I think, I mean, just to answer your first question before, and maybe your follow-up as well, is, are content providers and by extension, exchange point members willing to pay for a port? And I think that will typically come down to other models that develop for how an exchange point is run and operated commercially. And, when the traditional model for an exchange point starts to, probably become less effective, there would be other models that come up that, more akin to one or two that we've seen already in the region, in Africa at least anyway. And I think that will put pressure on existing exchange point models as well as new entrants to sort of follow those kinds of models that either have, not very close to zero or zero cost to the members. So I think that's where the exchange point, am I willing to pay for a port type situation is going to go.
So Mark, just to clarify, are you referring to the NAP Africa model, for example, where a data center runs an internet exchange point and therefore doesn't have to charge for ports because they generate the revenue from rack fees?
Well, Equinix had a data center and exchange point. That didn't go very well. But, maybe Terraco and NAP Africa did it a bit better. But if you look at Asteroid, for example, right, there's a totally different model as well compared to how it's done in Europe. So we're seeing the model starting to shift because the margins are simply too thin and the traditional cost models can't be supported anymore. So I think there'll be a lot of pressure on competitive models coming up, especially in the large regional areas, to compete with what has been a traditional, pay for a port model. Right.
Okay. Right. And this sort of leads me to another question. It's a bit tangential but related. Is how I'm wondering how access networks are going to react to this, right? Like, what's the landscape of access networks going to look like going forward? Are we going to see consolidation? Are access networks going to try to manipulate their way into monopolizing eyeballs and markets to have more leverage in the ecosystem of the future? Or is that, for example, Comcast? I go back to the Comcast example before where they tried to charge Netflix in the United States for an upgrade to their port. Are we going to see more of these sort of battles? And are we going to see aggregation in the access side? Or is that an unfounded fear? And maybe Geoff, you want to comment on that?
Look, of course you've already seen aggregation, and of course you're going to see more. It is a rule that this industry has adopted that every country has no more than 3 big mobile access network providers. And you go, but why 3? Why not 10? Why not 20? And there's a whole bunch of answers, including spectrum. But the basic answer is that's the number we all agreed upon. That's the market. And no matter where you look, sophisticated, developing, or any other spectrum, you actually only find 3 big providers. All the rest tend to be bit players. The other thing is that mobiles rule. Why? Because wires in the ground are a nightmare. No one wants them. It just ties up your money and buries it 6 foot under. So in some ways, you are what you are. The whole idea that you could hold everyone else to ransom by capturing those users was a model of operation that disappeared 20 years ago. And to think anyone can play that again now is dreaming. The real threat right now, and it is a threat and it's going to get worse, actually comes from above. And when folk like SpaceX start launching thousands of spacecraft, a small altitude above the Earth, the competition in spectrum and in customers is not from the person in the office beside you doing the similar business model with terrestrial based. The competition comes from above, where if I can launch enough spacecraft at a low enough cost, my potential market is 7 billion big. 7 billion. And if big wins, as it always has done so far, because big is all about capital efficiencies and so on, and this industry is volume based, just look at Google. If big wins, actually, oddly enough, your direst competitor, the one that you should be losing sleep over if you're in the access market, is above you, and not very far above either. That's the one you've really got to worry about. But yes, I'm like, it's always been a game for big, but trying to hold your users hostage and somehow broker them against content was something that the toll road operators tried 2 centuries ago, miserable failure. It's something that telephone companies tried, more recently, miserable failure. And if you play it again, unless you learn from this, if you play it again, you're just going to kid yourself. It's not a viable option.
Right. And so this nicely leads into one of my last questions, which is about how regulators and governments might react to this, or how should they react to it, right? Are they going to, we've talked a lot about, just to jump back, we've talked a lot about how on the ground, at least with IXPs, it's desirable to have a diverse access ecosystem, and competition effectively is a good thing. So, but in that light, how do we think how are regulators reacting to this around the world? Do they see this evolution as a good thing? Do they, what should they do? And what are some of the things that they should avoid? And I guess I'll jump right back to you, Geoff, and then we'll hand it off.
I'll start, but there are others with a view too. But the issue is, this internet is a product of market deregulation, not market regulation. Governments were sick and tired of supporting their telco and ploughing in taxpayer money to effectively a rotten and corrupt monopoly. So what they did was pull that apart, and they ripped that apart by saying, look, it's a market. You invest, you run the same risk as any other investor. And the role of the regulator isn't, oddly enough, to devalue my investment. The role of the regulator is to incent me to invest more in these markets. So it's not there to tell me how to invest my money or what to do. It's a market. And because it's a market, and you and I are players in that market, the issue is the regulator's job is to actually give them certainty and stability. That's all. So when I pop a few $1 billion into this market or that market, what I expect is that the conditions of my investment don't change, and that I can compete on equal terms with everyone else in the same market. And so the role of regulator is not the old days of the telco. This wire goes here, that price goes there. We're going to tell you what to do. The role of the regulator is to actually take a big step back and be confident that the actions of the market ultimately benefit consumers through better choice and, oddly enough, more investment in infrastructure and service. The world of today is a whole lot better as a result of that. We've got phenomenal investments in a span that would never have been possible with any form of government investment. We spent centuries building roads. We've spent a few years building digital infrastructure. What a difference. And so the role of the regulator, oddly enough, is to make things go faster, actually have folk invest with their own money inside markets, such as yours, such as mine. And that's the way we all get a better piece of infrastructure out of all of this. And so they shouldn't be trying to regulate IXPs or not, or anything else. That's not their job. Their job is to make the conditions available for folk to try out ideas in the marketplace. If they work, yay, you make money. If you don't make money, you don't have a right to exist. It was just a bad idea, okay? The market is both kind and cruel at the same time.
And just to add on top of that, you find a lot of governments and regulators, or regulators by extension of the government, trying to recover lost revenue by taxing content operators, who are situated, hundreds of thousands of miles away from where, the country and the people actually use it are. And they couldn't care, if they pay that or not, because they aren't physically there, because that's just how the internet is. It's borderless, as much as we'd not like to admit that in some of those economies. So, like Geoff is saying, the only option really for a government is to A, get out of the way and allow for innovation within reason, obviously. But then also, and most importantly, is if you feel that a Google or a Facebook or an Akamai or a Cloudflare is taking way too much capital outside of your economy, facilitate your own people to produce their own version of a Google or a WhatsApp or a WeChat or, whatever. That's what you do. You don't go, trying to lawsuit against Google to pay taxes in Nigeria. You find a way to make Nigerians come up with their own version of Google. That's where regulation and government can help, but not trying to stand, because you can't control. You've seen what happened in Australia. You just can't control the internet. If you try, like what happened in Uganda during the elections, it just doesn't work.
Right. And Ed, I want to, go ahead, Patrick, jump in. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and this is kind of what we're seeing in Europe with Gaia X, trying to reduce the reliance on international cloud giants. That's what they're doing, is I guess that's the project is to encourage businesses to look, at European growth solutions and protected by European data laws. Since as Mark was saying, there's no notable cloud platforms or, in Europe, they're relying on US or Chinese cloud platforms, and Gaia X, and GDPR are both things that are taking the focus to encourage more regionally the businesses. So we'll see what happens there.
Right, and Ed, as an internet exchange point operator, how would you advise governments? And I know this is a vague question, but to create a healthy ecosystem that an internet exchange point would thrive in.
So, being involved with a couple of the exchanges, both inside South Africa and outside, we have interesting discussions with quite a few of the regulators around us. And sort of, they definitely have been seeing the need and the importance of these internet exchanges. And I think there was perhaps a similar thing that happened in East Africa some years ago, where they decided that someone decided technically, from a governance perspective, they should really try and connect all these exchanges and make it happen magically. But I think it was as recent as late last year that the governments in a couple of the SADC countries came together and was like, yeah, it would be a good idea to interconnect all of them. And it's just a case of we preach the same story, is let them self-regulate, let them do their own thing. Many of the exchanges have been around for many, many years. I mean, in South Africa, the Jinx has been around for, I think, 25 years this year. Zimbabwe's got exchanges that have been around for similar periods, I think 24 maybe. And it's just, they run it their own and trying to get the regulators to understand that. And we're kind of partially successfully doing that, I suspect. But it's really just let them run. I'm trying to explain it, but every time a new face comes in, it's a new process to try and get that message across again. But I think that's the nature of government.
Right, and I don't know if you've dropped off or if it's my connection that's dropping a little bit, but I want to move on then. I think this is a natural point to sort of wind up the conversation, and I wanted to ask the panelists if they have any final thoughts on the subject that we've been talking about today. Final words, and I think with that, let's do it in. Let's start with CK.
Let me actually comment to use my speaking slot here and comment on the regulator aspect. I think for the other part, most of it is said as far as I'm concerned. I think some countries come to the idea that, they want to either regulate or use the regulator or the government to extort either their own organizations and companies or the other ones which are coming into the country. And if I see that, then usually my answer is that they are actually not competing either with the foreign company coming in or, with their own companies or try to get money out of it, that they actually best advised to open it up because they compete with the next country. If the next country has similar infrastructure, but is either open, right, adopt these services, and then they attract the investment and they are actually the one who gets the benefit. So if at all, I think the government and the regulator should be there for the overall country and not to extort money out of the telecommunication sector as much as possible.
Thanks.
That might be a little bit naive, I know.
No, well appreciated. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, I think for me, fundamentally, it's just a question of leadership, both in traditional infrastructure as well as at a government level. At a government level to sort of create an environment that allows local entrepreneurship and innovation for local solutions that are alternatives to, the big folk that are coming in everywhere. But also, leadership in traditional infrastructure to get away from traditional infrastructure, right? And begin to see what customers are actually looking for. And customers really just see infrastructure as something in between their device and where they need to go. So just leadership as to how to shift away from that culture into a new culture that actually provides more value, that keeps them more relevant and more visible in the eyes of the kids who don't care about whether they're in them or not.
Right. Patrick?
Let's see. Talking about IXs, one thing we haven't talked about, but maybe I don't want to totally jump into this, is we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about ISPs, but where I see IXs growing in importance is to large enterprises that there's really been a shift to enterprises instead of going to a single traditional provider that manages their network, is they're much more sophisticated in developing their own networks, and they're starting to build POPs, et cetera, and they're discovering IXs, and all of a sudden they have this rich ecosystem in front of them that, you know, now they can connect to a whole bunch of different ISPs or customers, or it's kind of this new world. And I see this as an area that's developing. I know, like on Equinix's side, you know, they've been working on this for, you know, over 5 years, but you know, we're seeing some uptake here as interconnectors, and we're not saying, you know, it can be company to company, end to end, but also to the cloud. I mean, using IXs to connect to cloud. So it's I think a big area, growth area that we're seeing.
I think that's a really good point. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think it highlights that in order to, we've kind of concluded a little bit throughout the panel that internet exchanges with large numbers of peers are going to do well. And I think getting to that point, or entrenching that point, or growing your exchange requires looking for new demand or new peers, in other words, right? And I think enterprise is a segment that's largely untapped by internet exchanges. And I think that's a really good idea. Yeah, thanks for that contribution. Ed, do you want to add some final thoughts?
Not really. I think I covered most of mine in my last session right at the end. So yeah.
All right, cool. And then on that note, then I'll hand over to Geoff. Do you have any
words? I think you're missing something here, and let me put the most provocative thought into your collective heads. You know, you go back about 50 years and networks mattered, edge devices and applications didn't matter in the slightest. And then we actually managed to make the edge devices more capable. They became computers rather than dumb telephones. And that suppressed the value in communications and carriage, and actually lifted the value of the platform. Microsoft was the biggest company in the world because of Windows. Platforms mattered, applications didn't. Now we're in the world of applications. We're in the world where all of a sudden, like with Quick and Google, we're dragging transport up into user space. With Doe, we're dragging the DNS up into the application space. Oddly enough, applications are everything. Nothing else matters. Literally, I don't care what I'm running on. My application is its own ecosystem. So we're in the world of paranoid applications and application-centric communications. The local infrastructure doesn't matter anymore. When I'm doing encrypted channels back to home base, I'm really only interested in the latency to home base and nothing else. And so you're trying to use 5-year-old views that platforms mattered and that infrastructure mattered in a world where the money has moved to applications are everything. And we're now living in an application-centric world where the applications are totally paranoid. They work in their own ecosystem. They leak nothing. Why is the Facebook app so large? Because it's an entire operating world inside the app. Everything is being dragged up there because all these platforms are now supercomputers. The applications are taking advantage of that. So think about a world where applications define their own connectivity and communications, irrespective of the local ISP, the local access provider, and the local exchange. If you're living in that world, I think you're actually living in the next few years. If you think that by mere dint of infrastructure, you have, if you will, a role to play, that's not a role that's going to sustain you. That's a very tenuous existence. So look at Google very hard and look at the way we're building really capable apps these days that are making their own decisions, independent of the platform, independent of the infrastructure, independent of even regulation. Think about that. And I think you're living in the world that I'm living in, this world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff. I really appreciate your vision, and I always enjoy reading your Potaroo blog as well.
Thanks.
And with that, I'd like to hand over to Caglar. We're going to end the session there, and I'm going to hand over to Caglar. He's going to give us the results of the poll questions and also a couple Q&As for the audience. Sorry, Shala, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Thank you very much, everyone. First of all, the result of the poll questions. The first question was how you heard about us. 20% is social media, 45% mailing list, 24% colleague or friend, 5% is AFPIF website, and 6% is other. And we would like to know what other is. If you could drop us an email, that would be very good. Thank you. Second poll question results. Do you think the internet industry's evolution will have a positive impact on society? 80% yeah, 6% no, and 15% is not sure. Thank you for that. With that, we have two questions for the panelists. First question is to Patrick. Now I can say your name correctly. What are the appetizers for cloud providers to build a POP in a certain country? It is from Haitham. You're on mute.
Said, oh, appetizers. Let's see. I'm sure CK can answer in more detail than this, but what we see in general is, well, we've been talking about international capacity, but that's one thing we like, but lots of capacity, rich ecosystem. So you have a lot of players there, a lot of ISPs, et cetera, IX, but very importantly, also low prices in the market, like metro prices. And a good example of this recently is Lagos, where we saw everybody had their eyes on Lagos. And because you're looking at the huge population, all those eyeballs, we have to go there. But the infrastructure was either extremely expensive or terrible. So once the content providers actually were coming in, putting the cash, et cetera, and kind of using their influence to go into a location like this, you see the prices start to drop. And now we've seen demand take off. So it's kind of chicken and egg too. The content providers are creating demand, but they're also looking at the factors that, could lead to big growth, like good interconnectivity, of course, rich ecosystem, and either like Lagos for Nigeria, either a huge population or onward connectivity, like say, looking at Nairobi, they have a great market there, but onward connectivity back into, Uganda, Rwanda, et cetera. So those are some of the elements, but that's very broad.
CK, what do you think?
I would differentiate again a little bit between cloud and content. I think content has a lower entry bar because there's that concept which many have copied from us, where you put a cache in an eyeballs network. In that regard, you pretty much need a certain amount of demand to justify it, whatever that is. And then, the typical a little bit of electricity and cash flow. So I guess that's the low end entry bar. For the internet exchanges and for a medium-sized CDN POP, we then need an IX transit, which is cheap enough that it made sense, and colo space. I guess that's also relatively easy. There is a regulatory aspect, actually, which we shouldn't forget. Depending on the country, they either have no view on content and cloud, or which is always a little bit dubious for American companies and their lawyers to then make a decision if that is a good or a bad country, or they go as far as they say, you're actually responsible for the content. And that might be easy in a Google and Facebook environment where these companies own the content. We don't own it, right? We are like an ISP for content. So if we are then also responsible for the content and liable, then we might have an opinion about that one. And then on the other extreme, you have basically the big cloud providers with their computational engine, and I just can guess to the degree I know what they do. You then need a lot of data center space and a lot of power with a certain, quality, whatever that might be, tier 3, 4, and enough connectivity so that actually the country or the neighboring countries can connect, right? Otherwise, you have stranded computational capacity, which nobody can use. So that the technical bar basically goes up from the left side of the CDNs to the cloud, you need more and more infrastructure.
Thank you very much. We were going to take 3 questions, but I can see that we are on time. So if you want, you can just mail us the questions and we will try to get them answered later on. With that, I thank all the panelists and I will hand over to Kyle to do the closing. Thank you.
Cool, thanks, Shalar. And I'd also like to point out that there's a virtual social after this event. And if your question wasn't answered, you're free to engage with any of our panelists in GatherTown. And I'll explain how to get involved in that in a moment. But first, I would like to thank all of our sponsors again. Links, PAX, Rack Center, NAP Africa, Flex Optics, and Facebook. One of the things I neglected to mention in the beginning when I was running through the sponsors is that Flex Optics is not just the interpretation sponsor for this event. They're sponsoring interpretation for all of our virtual peering series. So we'd like to thank them for that. And then next slide. So next session, we're going to be talking about the homegrown versus franchise IXP model part 2. So stay tuned for that. We're going to send out announcements and signups for that soon. Next slide. So now we're going to go through a couple stats about attendance. This one, I think, was our biggest, perhaps by double than one of the previous. Next slide. So we're very excited about that. We're grateful for all of you showing up. Let's see, VPS number 1, I think we had, what is this, attendance and views. So on Zoom, we had 166. Live stream, it looks like we got a lot on Facebook on that event. That's pretty interesting. Okay, right. So I hope you guys can all see the stats. I'm not going to run through them in detail, but this is a really interesting slide. So we had a total number of around 900 views in the first one, somewhere around 700 in the second. Yeah, and then around 550 in the third, 600 on the fourth, and then 577 across all platforms on the last. And I'll be interested to find out what the stats were like today on this one. We hit around, I think we hit around 200 people just on Zoom today. So I'll be keen to see what we do on the other platforms. Thanks for the data, guys. It's good that we keep track of this stuff. Yeah, again, it looks like we get about 50% of our audience from Zoom, which is to be expected. It's our primary platform. Next slide. Language. Okay, this is interesting. English or French? French live stream. That gets a lot of participation across the events, which is also to be expected because, of course, a lot of the region speaks French. Right. I mean, again, this is a lot of data, so we'll just leave it up on the screen for a minute. If anybody wants to look at it in depth, please just email us and we'll send it. I think we're also going to post this stuff on the website at some point. Next slide. Social media engagement. Periscope, right, okay. A lot on Periscope. I must be getting old because I have barely even heard of Periscope, but apparently there's a lot of activity happening on there. I'm with the elderly generation on Facebook. Again, lots of data. Feel free to take a screenshot or look for us to send this out on the web. Next slide. Unique countries. Okay, all right. So I guess the deeper blue means the more participation. We get a lot from SA on the first series and the fourth. A lot from SA, of course, in general. Participation from across Europe. Not a ton from Asia, unfortunately, but I suppose that's to be expected given that they're far away, different region, different, perhaps even different interests. Next slide. Right, so we've had 10 sponsors, APNIC, AM6, DKIX, Liquid Telecom has been a big one in the AFPIF universe for a long time. Links, Rack Center, Work Online, which also helps with the Women in Tech events that we've done in the past. Facebook and NAF Africa have been mainstays for the last couple of years. We're very grateful to them. And of course, Flex Optics, they've also been there with us for a long period of time, and they're very helpful with the interpretation. So thank you guys again. And with that, I think I'm going to hand over to Machuki, who's going to lead us through some peering personal slides and then tell us how to get to GatherTown so that we can all get some virtual beers together. And that's all from me. So thank you guys. And thank you again to the panelists. It's been a really good conversation. I took a lot out of this myself, and I hope the audience did. So Michuki, over to you.
Thanks, Kyle. And Henok, if you could put up the peering personal. So the first person to speak, I will invite to speak is Cyrus from Chemnet, AS328578.
Hello, guys.
We can hear you. Please proceed. Yes.
Okay. Chemnet is an upcoming ISP Kenya who are promoting local peering. We want like we want local peering to be the core, because if you look at the industry now, especially in Kenya, so many providers are coming on board, but when you look at the prices and stuff, it's so high. Yeah? So we're trying to promote that, and we hope more networks will come join us. In Kenya, we have managed to get a Netflix server, that's Netflix cache, which we are ready to help any network come on board. We are ready to serve you traffic. For the GGC, we are ready. Akamai, I think our leader here will work with us on something, but we welcome anybody who is ready to promote local traffic. Yeah, that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cyrus. Next is EcoBand Alex. Alexander, you.
Yes, hello.
Good.
Sorry. Yeah, my name is Alex Sulzberger. I'm the CEO of EcoBand Networks, and we are a Ghanaian ISP with a footprint now in several West African countries, and also POPs in Europe, in London and Paris. So we have an open peering policy, and we do already peer with many of the CDNs, not at least to the contacts we made at some AFPIF fora in the past. So thanks again for having these kind of events and introducing us operators to the CDNs and other players into the market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Next up is Renu. Brian.
Hello, thank you, Michuki. Brian Masiga. This is the Research and Education Network for Uganda. We are present at the Uganda Internet Exchange Point. We have an open peering policy. In case you want to connect with us, you can write to networks@renu.ac.ug. We are celebrating 15 years of connecting and collaborating in research and education in Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Next up is Amsik Emra.
Hi, Michuki, and hi, everyone. Thank you for the session, and thank you for all of your insights. As AM6, we are one of the leading internet exchange in the world. Our major platform is in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, we have 14 POPs where our customers can connect to us directly. And at the moment, we have almost 900 connected networks and almost 10 terabit per second peak traffic at our internet exchange. We have the root server, and you can see our peering DB link on the slide. Aside from Amsterdam, we have other internet exchanges around the world as well. In Hong Kong, in the US, in India, in the Caribbean, we have our own internet exchanges, and in Bahrain, we have a powered by internet exchange with our partner. And this year, we will launch 2 more new internet exchange with our partners, one in Uzbekistan and another one in Egypt. You can see our team on the photos. Please send us an email if you want to get additional information and connect to AM6. Thank you.
Thank you, Emra. Next up is Asteroid, Celine. Celine. Okay, see you're muted, but I think we're not getting audio. it just me? Or can we not hear something?
Yuki?
Yes, now I can hear you. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry for that. My headset was not working, apparently. Hi, everyone. Great to see some familiar faces today, even virtually. I thought this was a very exciting discussion. And as Mark pointed it out, IXP have to evolve and adapt to stay relevant. So that's what Asteroid is trying to do. We operate reliable local IXPs in a cost-effective manner. So we start small and we scale as the infrastructure grows. We really focus on Africa, and we started Mombasa IXP in February last year, so just a year ago, which interconnects now about 18 networks, which are Kenyan ISPs, content providers, but also ISPs from the wider region, like Mauritius, thanks to the subsea cables. We have 2 other IXPs coming up in Africa, which I'm very eager to announce, but that will be announced properly before the next webinar. And yeah, if you would like to see an IXP in your region, whether you are an end user or a data center operator, well, get in touch. I speak English and French, so very eager to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine. Thank you very much. And thank you also to our panelists and co-moderators, Kyle and Shala. That was really an excellent conversation. At this point, we will be heading off to the virtual social event. And before we do so, we'd like to take this opportunity to thank those who've been following up on the discussions through the live stream channels that we have available on Twitch, Periscope, Facebook, and so on. Thank you for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event on 4th of May. And we'll send the announcements and details on how to register for that in due course.